This video analyzes the game played between Zenisko Borowski, who played with the white pieces, and Mackenzie, who played with the black pieces. The code of the opening used was C90. This opening is called the closed Ruy Lopez with 7, d6, early deviations. Result: white won the game. What is the first move of the white player? White, pawn moves to e4. This first move occupies the center with a pawn and frees 4 squares for the queen and 5 for the f1 bishop. One of the reasons many players prefer 1.e4 to any other opening move is that it gels the kingside pieces rolling quickly, enabling early castling on that side. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to e5. In the old days this was almost compulsory. It indicated that you were willing to stand toe-to-toe and slug it out. Only a coward would avoid one black e5 and a possible gambit by white. Objectively considered, the next move is perhaps black's strongest response. It challenges possession of the center and prevents white from monopolizing it by continuing. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to f3. What happens if white persists and plays 2.d4? The reply to black pawn from file e takes at d4 leads to 3. Queen takes at d4. Knight moves to c6 4. Queen moves to e3. Knight moves to f6, when black has 2 pieces in play to one of white's. This amounts to taking the initiative away from white early in the game. The next move is far more effective than random development of the knight, for instance at h3, where it is out of touch with affairs in the center, or at e2, where it blocks all traffic. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to c6. The logical way to meet the attack on the pawn, a minor piece develops toward the center and defends the pawn. The general plan of mobilization is to establish a pawn in the center, develop the minor pieces, the knights before bishops, whenever feasible, then castle to get the rooks to the center files, and finally bring the queen out but not too far from home. Premature development of the queen is dangerous, as it is subject to annoying attacks by pawns and minor pieces. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to b5. The most natural move on the board. White strikes at the defender of the pawn he attacks. It is true that he cannot win the pawn at once, as after 4. Bishop takes at c6. Pawn from file d takes at c6 5. Knight takes at e5. Queen moves to d4. Black regains the pawn, but the pressure on black is constant, and the threat is always in the air. The Ruy Lopez is probably the strongest of all kingside openings. White has more to say in the center, since he will be able to play d4 without much trouble, while black will find it difficult to achieve black d5. White's pieces have more room to move around in, while black's game is considerably cramped in many variations. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to a6. This can become like the story The House That Jack Built. The pawn attacks the bishop that attacks the knight that defends the pawn that the knight attacks. Black's purpose is to dislodge the bishop from its favorable position. The loss of time involved in moving a pawn is compensated for by the fact that the threatened bishop must also lose a move in retreating. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to a4. This is in the spirit of the opening as it maintains pressure on the knight. The alternative withdrawal to c4 is inferior, as the same position could have arisen after the move 3. Bishop moves to c4, except that here black has the additional move black a6, which can only be to his benefit. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to f6. Black develops a piece, attacks a pawn and prepares early kingside castling. More could hardly be expected of one move. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, castles on the king's side. White brings his king to safety and swings the rook over toward the center files. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to e7. A favorite continuation with many players is 5. Black knight takes at e4, not with the idea of winning a pawn, as white regains it easily, but in order to obtain a tree, open game. The danger in this line is that it leaves black's position in the center somewhat insecure. The text leads to a more blocked position, difficult to break through, but requires patience on black's part. The bishop's development at e7 is satisfactory even though it has moved only one square away from home. The important thing is that it has left the back rank and facilitated castling. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook moves to e1. White brings his rook toward the center. In lieu of an open file, the rook prepares to take command of a file liable to be opened. In guarding his own e-pawn, white renews the threat of 7. Bishop takes at c6. Pawn from file d takes at c6. 8. Knight takes at e5, winning a pawn. The rook's move is preferable to developing the b1. Knight to c3. White may want to provide a retreat for his bishop by c3, guarding it against an exchange. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to b5. White meets the threat by forcing the bishop back. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to b3, obviously the only move. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to d6. Black protects the e-pawn, releases the c8 bishop and prepares 8. Black knight moves to a5 to remove the troublesome enemy bishop. At first glance it seems illogical, give one bishop freedom while hemming in the other, but since the dark squared bishop does a good job at e7, it remains for the light squared bishop to go out into the world. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to c3 with 2 objects, to provide refuge for the bishop against an attempt to remove it by 8. Black knight moves to a5. To support an advance of the d-pawn, establishing a strong pawn center. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to a5, not so much to strike at the bishop as to make way for 9. Black c5 to dispute control of the central squares. In this line of the Lopez, black's best counter chances lie in action on the queen side. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to c2. Naturally, white wants to keep both bishops. He loses a tempo, but it is offset by black's posting of a knight at the side of the board. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to c5. Black intensifies his pressure on the central square d4 and provides an egress, as the old books used to say, for the queen. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to d4. One of the chief objectives in king's pawn openings is to advance the d-pawn to the center as soon as circumstances permit, just as in queen's pawn openings it is desirable to get the e-pawn to e4 when there is an opportunity to do so. White again threatens to win the e-pawn by the double attack on it. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to c7. Black gives his pawn further support and develops his queen at the same time. It would not do to exchange by 10. Black pawn from file e takes at d4. 11. Pawn from file c takes at d4. Pawn from file c takes at d4. 12. Knight takes at d4 as it surrenders the center and leaves black with an isolated center pawn. An isolated pawn, says Tartakower, casts gloom over the entire chessboard. White would benefit too in that his knight, standing firmly in the center of the board, could not be dislodged by unfriendly pawns. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to h3 to prevent the pin. Black bishop moves to g4, which might embarrass the knight and the piece it shields, the queen. Both pieces are needed for the protection of the d-pawn and the maintenance of the pawn formation in the center. An exchange of the white knight by black bishop takes at f3, and the recapture by the queen, removes at one stroke two supports of the d-pawn. Is white violating principle in moving one of the pawns near his king? Maybe, but one must know when to slight conventions as well as observe them. In this particular situation it is important to prevent an attack on the knight, its subsequent exchange and the breakup of white's pawns in the center. The move of the h-pawn is weakening, but a lesser evil than would result from permitting the pin. But wait a moment. Is it a weakening move if black is unable to benefit by it? Is it detrimental to the position if black cannot exploit it by a kingside attack? The answer is no. A move is weak only if the opponent can turn its imperfections to his advantage. The entire position is strong or weak only in relation to the position of the opponent. In this case, the move of the h-pawn is expedient as it conforms to the requirements of the specific position. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to c6, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been castles on the king's side, the knight returns and adds weight to the pressure on the d-pawn. Black threatens a series of exchanges by 12. Black pawn from file e takes at d4 13. Pawn from file c takes at d4. Pawn from file c takes at d4, resulting in the gain of a pawn, as the further sequence 14. Knight takes at d4. Knight takes at d4 15. Queen takes at d4. Queen takes at c2 would cost white a piece. Black hopes to tempt white into playing 12.d5 to meet this threat. This looks good, as it would evict the c6 knight from a good post, but it has the drawback, for white, of releasing the tension in the center, as well as making d5 unavailable for the use of his pieces. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to e3. White is in no hurry. He brings end to the d-pawn by developing another piece. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, castles on the king's side, removing the king to safer quarters and pressing the rook into active service. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight from file b moves to d2. This knight has been developed where he has little mobility and seems to have no future to speak of, but it is the first step that counts. Little as this is, its consequence is worth emphasizing. The knight's move clears the first rank and enables the major pieces, the queen and the rooks, to get in touch with each other. Get your pieces off the back rank and into active play. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to d7. Black does likewise, his bishop vacates the back row to let the rooks come to the center files. The rooks are powerful pieces and must not be shut in. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook moves to c1. In the early stages of the game, the rooks may not do much, but they must be ready for action when it comes. This they best do by placing themselves at the head of open files. If none are available, then they should work on partly open files. If none of those exist, the rooks should still be brought toward the center, as those files are most likely to be opened. But in any case, get the rooks out of the corners. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to e8, planning to advance the f-pawn. This pawn will dispute the center with white's c-pawn while opening the f-file for the rook. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to f1. The knight retreats to gain momentum for a leap to g3 and then f5. A beautiful outpost. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to g6, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been knight moves to f6, not only to keep the knight out but also to support 16. Black f5, a thrust at the center. The advance of the g-pawn weakens the squares f6 and h6, as they are no longer guarded by the pawn. This may strike the average player as an interesting but perhaps insignificant point, but recognizing a weakness and knowing how to take advantage of it marks the master player. Good players do not win games by waiting for you to make monumental mistakes. They don't expect you to leave pieces en prise. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to h6. White immediately anchors a piece on one of the vulnerable kingside squares. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to g7, the only move to prevent loss of the exchange by 17. Bishop takes at f8. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to e3. The knight comes back into the game by a slightly different route than was planned earlier. Not only does it add to the pressure on d5, but it also threatens to settle down powerfully on that square. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook from file a moves to e8. Black could not stop the knight coming in by 17. Black bishop moves to e6, as 18.d5 in reply wins a piece. He also abandons the contemplated break by 17. Black f5, as it opens the position, and open lines favor the player whose development is superior and who is better equipped to use these lines in an attack. With his actual move, Black tries to keep a tightly knit defensive position, one that is difficult to break through. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to d5, a very fine move whose object is more profound than the obvious one of fixing a piece on a strong central square. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to b7. The queen must flee from the knight's attack. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight takes at e7 check. This is the point. The knight gives up his good position for a worthy cause. It is important, in order to capitalize on the weakness of the dark square f6, to remove the guardian of this square, the dark squared bishop on e7. With this bishop out of the way, the weakness is accentuated and white can then consider some means of invading, and then fastening a piece, on the critical square. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook takes at e7. This is forced, as 19. Black knight takes at e7 20. Pawn from file d takes at e5. Pawn from file d takes at e5 21. Knight takes at e5 costs a pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn from file d takes at c5. This was an inaccuracy. The purpose of this exchange is to open a nice long file for the queen. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn from file d takes at c5. Black must recapture or lose a pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to d6. Beautiful exploitation of the open d file. The attack on the c-pawn gains a tempo toward the queen's entry at f6. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to c4. Black must lose a move in saving this pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to f6 with this move, which incidentally threatens instant mate. White fastens another piece in the holes in black's position created by the move black g6. White's advantage is decisive and the winning procedure should be what the books call a matter of technique. The process of realizing his advantage is an interesting one. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to h5. Black stops the mate and attempts to drive the queen away. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to h4. It would be a mistake to play 23. Queen moves to g5 as black, instead of moving his threatened rook on f8, would first play 23. Black f6, banishing the queen completely from his premises. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to g7, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been rook moves to c8, the knight blocks the bishop's attack on the rook and is prepared to counter 24. Queen moves to f6 by 24. Black knight moves to h5, repeating the device of harassing the enemy queen. How does white continue to force a win? What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to e3 by rearranging his pieces and bringing up the reserves. This first move in the new formation gains time by the threat of 25. Bishop moves to c5, winning the exchange. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to e6, this was a mistake. A better move would have been pawn moves to f6, the only way to prevent 25. Bishop moves to c5, after which white completely dominates the dark squares. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to f6, this was a mistake. A better move would have been knight takes at e5, once more into the breach. Black cannot save the game by repealing moves, since after 25 black knight moves to g7 26. Bishop moves to c5, rook moves to e6, or 26 black knight moves to h5 27, queen moves to h4, and white wins the exchange, 27. Queen moves to h4 rfe 8 28. Knight moves to g5, the threat of mate will win the rook at e6. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to c7, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been knight moves to f4, black must hang on to the valuable e-pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to h6 once again white has his ideal position, with pieces firmly planted in the holes near black's king. It will be hard for black to chase them off as he does not have the earlier resource. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook moves to c8, this was a mistake, a better move would have been bishop moves to c8, the rook must flee the bishop's attack interposing the knight instead is of course a blunder as mate follows instantaneously. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook from file c moves to d1, this was a mistake, a better move would have been knight moves to g5, before proceeding to the final attack, white gets a stronger grip on the position by seizing the open d file. The next step, since black must wait helplessly, is 28. Rook moves to d5, attacking the e-pawn a third time and threatening to double rooks on the file. This ought to be enough to beat down resistance if no quicker win is available. Note that white has not embarked on dubious long-range combinations. His plan, in most cases aimed at increasing his positional superiority, is made for a few moves only. Don't believe all those stories you hear of chess masters analyzing intricate combinations with dozens of variations for 30 moves ahead. They don't do this because they don't have to. It is far easier and more to the point to look only a few moves ahead and try to maintain at least an equal game at every stage. Winning by accumulating small advantages is more consistent with a common sense approach than to seek to overwhelm the opponent with bewildering combinations and venturesome sacrificial attacks. Strengthening one's own position gradually while undermining that of the opponent is more important than indulging in fruitless speculative fancies. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook from file e moves to e8, this was a mistake, black's idea is to reduce the pressure by offering an exchange of queens. White will then either have to acquiesce to the exchange, or withdraw his queen. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to h2, a very fine move. The knight, which seemed well posted at f3, is rerouted to augment the pressure on the dark squares. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to d8, this was a mistake, a better move would have been rook from file c moves to d8, continuing the plan of evicting white's queen from his camp. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to g4. White supports his queen and is ready, in the event of an exchange of queens, to maintain a tight grip on the dark squares. If black plays 29, black queen takes at f6, then 30. Knight takes at f6, check. King moves to h8 31. Rook takes at d7 wins a piece for white. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to e7. This does not help, but there is no way to save the game. If 29, black rook moves to e7, then 30. Bishop moves to e3, threatening 31. Knight moves to h6, check. King moves to f8 32. Queen moves to h8, checkmate. 30. Black rook moves to e8 31. Knight moves to h6, check. King moves to f8 32. Queen takes at f7, checkmate. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen takes at e7. The simplest. If no mate is in sight, the modern master dispenses with the fireworks. Dawdling is for dilettantes, so he simplifies and cuts down any chance of resistance. After 30, black rook takes at e7 31. Knight moves to f6, check. King moves to h8 32. Rook takes at d7. White wins a piece, giving black no opportunity to complicate the ending.